Thank you again, Mr. Speaker, on this very important day debating C-11. And I guess, I've asked this question many times before, but I'm going to ask it this way. Do you trust the Prime Minister to defend your freedom of speech? Because that's the essential, the crux of our debate from our party to the parties across the way. And I'd say, other concerns have been brought up by other parties. They're still going to support the bill, but that doesn't mean that there isn't concerns around this and possible threats to user-generated content, and they could possibly be implicated by this legislation. And again, it's not just us. There's many people across Canada that have read the bill, have been brought to testify with their worries about what potential that it has. But I'm going to get into it. So Bill C-11, this is the bill, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act and to make related and consequential amendments and other acts. And I always like to use facts, and I'll refer to different commentary on it, but let's get right into it. So what is C-11 used to be a bill called C-10. And I have an article in front of me. It's from May 20th of 2021, because this is really where all this started. And with a little section, I'm going to refer to this quite a bit, 4.1. This is the little hiccup for the Liberals that has a lot of Canadians worried about calling it the censorship bill. I'll read the article is called What is Bill C-10 and Why Are Liberals Planning to Regulate the Internet? And it's from Globe and Mail. So I'm going to turn a couple pages in. The bill is currently being reviewed by the House of Commons Heritage Committee. Members of that committee were studying the document line by line, but that process was disrupted in late April when Liberals on the committee moved an amendment that removed a section of the bill. That sounds very familiar to a particular part of legislation C-21, where they just table drop or pull amendments out of legislation. The change was approved on division, meaning there was no recorded vote to show which opposition party sided with the Liberals. This segment, section 4.1, provided an exclusion for user-generated content. Removing that exclusion set off concerns that the legislation could then be used to regulate Canadian social media posts. And that's what we've been talking about across the country for the last 3 years. Worries about censorship in this government and this particular bill. Because this bill didn't end. I'm going to go, and I'll read some other comments from this particular article. I'll move on. However, other critics draw a distinction between users specified in 2.1 and 4.1's exclusion for user-generated content, and so maintain that social media posts could still be subjected to the legislation. And last paragraph. On May 7th, the Liberals introduced a new amendment that they said would put these questions to rest. The text of the new amendment is very similar to the text of section 4.1 that was originally removed, but was added to a different section of the bill that defines the regulatory powers of the CRTC. The government says this change ensures that the posters of user-generated content are not regulated. And I'll move on to the next section, and I'm going to read from the bill. So that's back in the day. And we were all supposed to be reassured that it was all going to be great. Well, the problem is that section 4.1 has remained. They could have easily dealt with concerns of the parties even across the way and us and put that to bed. But so I'm going to read the sections directly of the current legislation, C-10, but the numbers are still the same, Mr. Speaker. So this is 4.12b and 4.2.2. It's on page 9 of the actual act. So Canadians out there watching can read it for themselves. And it takes a lawyer, even lawyers get confused at some of this wording, but I'll give it a go. This act does not apply in respect of a program that is uploaded to an online undertaking that provides social media service by a user of the service for transmission over the internet and reception by users of the service. It goes on. Despite subsection 1, so it just says basically, despite what we just said, this act applies in respect of a program that is uploaded as described in that subsection if the program is uploaded to the social media service by the provider of the service or the provider's affiliate, or by the agent or mandatory of either of them or is prescribed by regulations made under Section 2. So it opens the door to user-generated content wide open, that it could be possibly regulated by the CRTC. Okay, I'll go on to 4.2. And again, this is the really difficult one to follow, but let's go. For the purpose of this 4.2.1, for the purposes of paragraph 4.12b, the Commission may make regulations prescribing programs in respect of which this Act applies in a manner that is consistent with freedom of expression. Sounds great, right? Except, in making regulations under subsection 1, the Commission shall consider the following matters: the extent to which a program uploaded to an online undertaking that provides a social media service directly or indirectly generates revenue. Well, Mr. Speaker, that opens, despite the reassurance that, hey, user-generated content is going to be exempted, the door is flung wide open again. How are we ever going to regulate? How are they ever going to regulate content that could produce revenue, right? It could be a share of a post or whatever. Some other content provider shares a post that was previously not funded, and it opens the door to user-generated content, like I said before. And really, the implications are as vast as what we've been saying. I'll go on to say it isn't just us that have talked about these being significant issues. And I've said that in my speech. I'll refer to testimony at the Senate hearing committees, Honorable Paula Simons, who's going to refer to the former CRTC head. So it isn't just a senator making a comment in a general way. It's this is actually referring to the former head of the CRTC that are voicing their concerns. Several expert witnesses, including Monica Auer, Executive Director for the Forum for Research Policy and Communications, Robert Armstrong, a broadcasting consultant, economist, and former CRTC manager, and Ian Scott, who was at the time head of the CRTC, testified before our committee about the concerns that subclause 7.7 of the bill could give new and unprecedented powers to Cabinet, that Cabinet right over there, to intervene in independent CRTC decisions. As Dr. Armstrong put it in his testimony before us, in this sense, Bill C-11 reduces enormously, potentially, the powers that the CRTC has and hands them over to the Government of Canada. And that isn't just some random person walking down the street. This is the former heads of the CRTC, right? And this all is testimony that this Liberal government just says, hey, no biggie. Just ignore that expert testimony. And I see I have a few minutes left. I'll keep going. But I think the biggest and most critical amendment we made was to a vexing part of the bill, subclause 422, the one that I just read, which I like to call the exception to the exception clause. In wake of some of the controversy around C-10, the Minister of Canadian Heritage promised. That Bill C-11 would not pertain nor capture users of social media, but only big streamers who were analogous to traditional broadcasters. Indeed, that is what Clause 411 of the bill says, that the Act does not apply to a program that is uploaded to a social media service by a user of that service. Unfortunately, Clause 422 of the bill, as it came to our committee, undid that assurance by giving the CRTC the power to scope in a program uploaded to a social media service if it directly or indirectly generates revenues. That exception to the exception clause rightly worried all kinds of small and not so small independent producers who use services such as YouTube, TikTok to distribute their programming, though they retain the copyright. So, Mr. Speaker, I've got a lot more here. I could put stacks out here and read them out for the record, but I think what I started off by asking, can we trust this Prime Minister, with your privacy and to protect your freedom of speech? And I think, and I take that testimony from some pretty solid folks who were actually at the head of CRTC, and they said, hey, we're worried about the potential of this thing. I think we need to heed that advice. I think Canadians out there that are watching this, and many that are going to watch it online from some of our content that we generate, they're concerned about where this is going in a very, very bad direction. And I look forward to the questions, but I think the answer is very clear. We cannot trust this Prime Minister to defend our freedom of speech. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. L'honorable député de Sherbrooke.
The honourable member for Sherbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
A drastic shift in Canada's broadcasting sector, which has directly impacted the level of support for Canadian programming and talent. Does my colleague believe that continuing to treat online and traditional broadcasters differently is fair?
Honourable member for Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Well, I think, there's a lot of Canadians here, and we have former artists too on our side that want to see Canadians do well, that produce content. I produce content myself. A lot of us in this House produce content. We want to make sure that we continue to do that. But I think what the member asked about, it kind of, it's fine if you can produce content and freely send it out to the internet and people can purchase it or watch it at their choice. But the problem we have is that if a directive is given by this cabinet, as has been warned by this particular former head of CRTC, says, look, they have the potential to say, we don't want you to watch things that have that word in them, or they're from this particular area in the country, or this area. That's the potential that it has. We've seen examples around the world where this happens, and I think we need to, again, like I said, we cannot trust this cabinet, this Liberal cabinet and Prime Minister to defend our freedoms.
Questions and comments? L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Mirabel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we know that C-11 was requested by the government of Quebec. C-11, or its equivalent, was asked by Quebec's cultural milieu. The government of Quebec asked to be consulted when C-11 will be applied for the Quebec context, but Conservatives, despite this, continue to tell us, just based on one expert that appeared for every single committee, this one expert and the Conservatives continue to say that this is against the freedom of expression. Are they saying that the government of Quebec is against the freedom of expression when it seeks simply to protect its culture and the promotion of Francophone and Quebec culture?
Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Well, I would just say us, as compared to the Bloc, we're a party that's not willing to trade away our freedoms. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I know you're aware, I think it's important for Canadians at home to know that tonight's vote isn't on C-11. It's on the message from this House of Commons going to the Senate with respect to the amendments that the Senate sent here. Whether we agree with with the substance of that message. In particular, it also includes a message to disagree with the amendment from Senators Simons and Mivelle Deschênes with respect to addressing user-generated content. I wonder if the member for Peace River, Prince George, Westlock would like to comment on specifically that motion.
It makes me feel good that I'm not the only one that up sometimes. Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Well, my riding is very similar to my Albertan colleagues, but we're from British Columbia. We have Peace River in British Columbia as well. No, but I would just say, the amendments, if it would address the concerns around user-generated content, I think you'd have a whole bunch of ears listening over here. But the bill is flawed. We've been talking about this bill since C-10 for many years. It's flawed still today. And it frankly doesn't cut it for us on this side of the aisle. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the honourable member for Fort McMurray, Cold Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank my colleague from Northern BC for his amazing speech. I'm just wondering if he can explain some of what he's heard from some of his constituents, who I'm sure are very similar to those I've heard from in Northern Alberta, that are very concerned about what this is going to mean, about what they're going to be able to see and say on social media platforms. Thank you.
I just want to say I really like the scarf of the Nova Scotia Titan. The honourable member for Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, and thanks to my colleague from Alberta, especially what local folks and my neighbours are saying about this. I think a lot really supported, and we support freedom in this country, and we saw an example of overreach by this government not that long ago, just over a year ago, where bank accounts were shared with groups. The accounts were shut down just but because people wanted to voice their freedoms. And so it leads to the next step. Well, what if this government doesn't like a particular movement or doesn't like a particular party or doesn't like a particular message? Well, let's just make a call to the CRTC and say, hey, shut her down. That's what my residents are talking about there, that they're very worried about. They've seen examples of it already, and I think those concerns are warranted.